Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to be talking about totalitarian society within Europe during World War II. We'll talk about some of the components of totalitarianism and what made it so effective at building these sort of wartime regimes, and also what made it so oppressive to live under for the people who had to live under these totalitarian societies. So, here's our objectives for today. We'll take a moment to take them in, and then let's move on. So the Axis powers are going to continue to expand. When we last left our heroes in Europe, Germany had conquered France, had taken over Denmark and Norway, had Poland was already partitioned, all of that. So we're also going to see an occupation of Greece at this time. Greece is at least partially occupied by Italy, with some parts of it occupied by Germany, some areas in the south set up for submarine bases, and then Bulgaria is going to ally with Germany, set up their own fascist government, and occupy some parts of northern Greece. The Axis powers are also eventually hoping to launch an invasion of the Middle East, theoretically taking over Turkey. Germany has a plan to attack the Soviet Union, but once they're done with that, they were hoping to move down into Iran, Iraq, take over the Middle East, and then as their advance across northern Africa continues, hopefully then move in that direction, take over the Suez Canal, and eventually conquer the Middle East to provide the Axis with a permanent supply of oil. Italy is going to also launch an invasion of Ethiopia, attempting to sort of redeem themselves for their humiliating defeat during the whole European age of imperialism. Ethiopia is going to be effectively crushed by Mussolini, taking over Italy, or taking over by the Italians, and then establishing Italian puppet state there. Here's Mussolini posing on top of a tank to show the great victory of the Italian people over the Ethiopians. And for the Germans, they're going to try to push across British-controlled Egypt to theoretically take the Suez Canal. The great German general who ran the Africa Corps in World War II was Erwin Rommel, who became known as the Desert Fox for his fantastic tank maneuvers in the desert. He was eventually stymied at the Battle of El Alamein. And so in El Alamein, British tank forces were able to defeat and slow down Nazi tank forces, establishing more of a stalemate in North Africa. The British forces were led by General Montgomery here, and this is going to prevent the Germans from taking the Suez Canal and is going to slow down their planned invasion of the Middle East. And so El Alamein is important because it shows it's sort of the pinnacle of Axis power in North Africa. The French forces are going to take over the rest of North Africa there, and although all of North Africa will be controlled by the Axis, they will not be able to move into the sort of oil-rich areas of the Persian Gulf. And so that's going to significantly slow down Axis expansion. We're also going to see the establishment and the growth of totalitarian control. Totalitarianism has all of these different things. To some degree, it's similar to fascism, except we're starting to see mass surveillance of the population, police terror, things like that. And the growth of propaganda is also going to be a huge component of totalitarianism. And so take a moment and note all of these sort of areas of totalitarian control. And we're going to see a lot of these similar things happening in Nazi Germany, in Japan, in the Soviet Union, and these other totalitarian states. In Germany, the SS were Hitler's paramilitary secret police. Heinrich Himmler is going to be the leader of the SS and is going to control these paramilitary forces. And they are going to, of course, both ensure that the German people fall in line with Hitler and his sort of program, but also that Nazi leaders and the army and all other elements of German society are on with Hitler and the Nazi program. The Gestapo, as they were known, were relatively effective and, of course, create this sort of atmosphere of police terror that is really necessary for these totalitarian dictators to maintain control. We also get significant censorship. Book burnings were important from Hitler's rise to power, burning all sort of what they see as degenerate literature, all, obviously all sort of liberal writers and things like that, but also, Jewish writers and more or less anything else that they want to try to eliminate. And so trying to eliminate these sources of knowledge, with the idea being, we're trying to get rid of these dangerous ideas that might threaten our vision for a perfect society. We also get propaganda, specifically propaganda focusing on children. The Hitler Youth and other organizations were absolutely essential in Hitler's rise to power and his continued authority over Nazi Germany. Talking about building a future for German youth is, of course, very important as far as these totalitarian movements go. And these youth organizations become a real source of strength for leaders like Hitler, both because they indoctrinate kids young, they get them used to military style discipline, they establish loyalty to the state and the leader, and then they provide a very fertile sort of recruiting ground for soldiers, in these sort of endless wars that totalitarian leaders push themselves into in order to demand their continued control over society. Here we see how especially empowering children in the Nazi movement is really important. So take a moment and pause. And then, so winning over the children is a way that state control can be further solidified. The Hitler Youth were the main source of this, again, focusing on physical fitness, Nazi ideology, and military style discipline. Hitler is both converting the children of Germany to his ideology of Nazism and prepping them to take the place of the soldiers who are going to die in the wars that he has started. And so the Hitler Youth become a central piece of most German youth's lives. And this is going to, significantly increase the power of Hitler and the state, because you've got these loyal children who are basically surveilling the rest of society. Here, Hitler is explaining Hitler explaining his philosophy. Take a moment and pause, read, and then we'll move on. Of course, a huge part of this is the demonization of enemies, and specifically for Hitler, the demonization of Jewish people. Anti-Semitism was baked into the Nazi philosophy, both from the stabbed in the back myth that had sort of led to Hitler's rise to power, and then his persecution of Jewish people. Jewish people were often easy to persecute because of dietary restrictions, specific customs, specific marriage within Jewish groups, and specific clothing. They were often easy to single out as an other group to be somewhat feared and persecuted. And so it became pretty easy for Hitler to both spread this stabbed in the back myth here that the Germans were defeated in World War I somehow because of the betrayals of Jewish people, and also to then take actions against Jewish people once he was in power. Hitler passed a series of laws called the Nuremberg Laws, which established the importance of sort of genealogy, and specifically the amount German versus the amount Jewish that you were, established like what privileges you had in society, where what jobs you could have, where you could live, who you could marry, things like that. And so we see that genealogy was very important, and that any amount of Jewish blood would make you to some degree suspect. And then, of course, if you have multiple Jewish grandparents, this becomes really problematic for your future within Nazi Germany. Eventually, leading to isolation and then persecution and genocide. And so this happened very early on in Hitler's reign, and he's just going to expand this persecution of Jewish people, specifically, targeting Jewish people even before the war started. So Kristallnacht was sort of the first attacks on Jewish people and Jewish synagogues, Jewish neighborhoods, things like that, where Hitler and his followers attacked Jewish businesses and establishments. The goal of this Night of Broken Glass is to intimidate Jewish people into leaving Germany or into giving up their possessions or moving away from sort of these German population centers. Deportation was generally the next step as far as trying to force Jewish people out to some extent. The problem was during this time period, not many places would accept Jewish refugees. The Soviet Union was one place that would sometimes accept Jewish refugees. Sweden was another. Spain, being a fascist country, would accept Jewish refugees. And then Palestine was another one as far as places where Jewish people would flee. But a lot of other European and European countries closed their doors. And the United States also famously refused to accept refugees, Jewish refugees from Germany and from other places, turning around ships full of Jewish people and sending them back to Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. The United States had passed a series of restrictive immigration quotas that we had talked about in previous lessons. And so they refused to relax these quotas, even with Jewish people facing persecution and eventually death. And so there's limited options for Jewish people as far as escaping from Nazi Germany. The next step was segregation in ghettos. Jewish people in Nazi-controlled areas were moved into specific parts of the city, put under armed guard with fences, and basically locked in. These Jewish districts were then often subjected to economic pressure and eventually cut off from food, as the Germans are going to eventually try to force the Jewish people to relocate to the concentration camps. And so the segregation of Jewish people sort of isolate them from view, and then economically and later literally, physically starve them until they either die or accept moving to sort of the more permanent solution that Hitler's going to come up with. In Japan, we saw some of this. It wasn't near as extreme as a lot of the totalitarian societies in other places. I mean, to some extent, you see, of course, propaganda demonizing enemies. You see mobilizing of, women and children on the home front in order to fight. You see rhetoric about all of Japan struggling and suffering. But the amount of social control that the Japanese government had over its citizens was to some degree less than we saw in some of the other totalitarian societies. So you had training, military training for all Japanese people, and trying to connect all of the Japanese efforts to the war effort in China, and then eventually the war effort in the Pacific. And you see, children training with swords and things like that, tying all of this to, again, traditional Japanese values. But you didn't see the level of police terror in Japan that you would have seen in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or some of these other totalitarian societies. And of course, the United States is also going to use propaganda, as is England, as are other places, in order to try to mobilize their citizens for total war. World War II is a total war unlike any war we've ever seen. And so we're going to see, again, full mobilization of society. We're going to see rationing of resources in a way that we've never seen before. We're going to see demands put on civilian populations as they're subjected to horrific pressures. And then, of course, we're going to see actions against civilians on a scale we've never before seen in World War II. And so World War II is really a different animal in a lot of ways as far as fully mobilizing an industrial society on a scale that humans have never done up to this point. We also see to some degree the demonization of enemies in the United States. Specifically, the internment of Japanese Americans is probably one of our worst moments, as we force Japanese Americans into camps because of fears that they might be disloyal or willing to fight against the United States or for Imperial Japan. And so Japanese people are interned, and that internment is oftentimes upheld by the Supreme Court. And so as far as violations of civil rights go, the United States is not immune from this, although obviously it's on a very different scale than we're seeing in places like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. So that brings us to the end for today. When we come back next time, we'll talk about Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the opening up of the Eastern Front, and the massive expansion of World War II that happens. But for now, we'll leave you there. So thank you for listening.